For more than 50 years, the rolling pastures of Connecticut's Farmington Valley served as office for Dr. Harry Werner, a legendary veterinarian whose career bore witness to a profound transformation in American agriculture. With his wife and partner, Susan Werner, they navigated the challenges of 24/7 business through decades of changing country life, watching the profession evolve from an era of clinical intuition to hyper-specialized, high-tech modern medicine. In today's episode, Dr. Werner shares the remarkable, often humorous, and deeply moving stories of a lifetime spent in the stalls, revealing not just how the care of our farm animals has changed, but how a family with a strong dedication built a long-lasting legacy in veterinary care in the Farmington Valley. Welcome to Avon Talks. Today our guest is Dr. Harry Werner. Dr. Werner is going to be sharing some stories about his career as in veterinary medicine. Fire away. Tell me a few stories about your history in the Valley.
Well, I am a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. I graduated in 1974 and was fortunate to come right to the Farmington Valley. I was hired by Drs. Milkey and Davis in Granby, and my job description was as a general large animal practitioner. That meant horses, cows, sheep, goat, pigs, the occasional llama. And I stayed there 4.5 years and then moved to North Granby and opened my own general large animal practice, which I pursued for about 20 years, and then converted it to all equine, all horses, in a general sense.
Exclusively horses in the later part of your life.
Horses, donkeys, and mules, yes. So that's my history. I retired in 2020. And frequently my wife and I will be driving around. We'll go by a property that's maybe still a farm or years ago was a farm, now has development on it. And I'll look at that and I'll recall an episode, something that happened. And I'll say to Susan, now look at that place. Here's what happened there years ago. And finally, she said to me, you need to write these things down. Begin to write these down. I think she was being kind in her choice of words. What she really meant was before you get so far off you can't remember anything.
No.
But we're up to, in writing them down, we're up to something like 125 different stories, and you can all relax. I'm not going to tell them all today.
Well, I'd like for you to share a few of them.
Sure. Well, why don't I start off with a real Avon story? This was many years ago. There was a married couple, Penelope and Percy. And they were wonderful people. They were great clients, wonderful people. Percy was a senior partner in one of the big law firms in Hartford. Penelope was his wife. She was a lifelong horsewoman. She even walked with the limp to prove it. And she would go to Timonium, Maryland, every autumn and buy a weanling thoroughbred horse, not to race it, but to bring it back to Connecticut, take care of it over the winter of the following year, break it to ride, and then sell it as a show hunter. So they had a small stable in Avon, and I did their work. And one day, and when I talk about Penelope and Percy, think The Great Gatsby.
Okay. Well-off,
yes,
glamorous people.
Absolutely. They were born at the turn of the last century, and so they came of age in the 1920s. Flapper girls and prohibition and kind of wild behavior, but wonderful people, very kind people. But that was their nature. So one day, Penelope called me early in the morning. "Oh, Dr. Werner," she said, "my new colt, has cut his leg on his shin, and I think he's going to need a few sutures." I said, "Well, that's fine, Penelope, but I am tied up pretty much till the end of the day. I'll be up around 5 o'clock. In the meantime, turn a cold hose on that, put a bandage on it, and we'll take care of it at the end of the day." She was fine with that. So I finished all my calls other than that and drove up to their place. They had a semicircular driveway in the front, and it was always, this was in the days long before cell phones, so you couldn't text and say, I'm on my way. So it was always my practice to give them a rough idea when, and then go to the house first, knock on the door, let them know I was there. So I pulled in the driveway, parked my vehicle, and went up and knocked on the door. And this was warm weather. I could see the screen door was shut, but the big door behind it was open a few inches. And so after a few moments, I see a woman's foot place itself between the two doors and push open the big door. And standing there, looking quite lovely, was Penelope, holding a martini in each hand, and beautifully attired in a string of pearls and her black high-heeled shoes.
Nice.
And that was it. Now, I was not used to being greeted at the door that way. She was not at all fazed. She looked at me and said, "Oh, Dr. Werner, I thought you were Percy." And she said, "I'll be to the barn in just a moment." And she quite calmly turned around and sauntered off slowly down the hallway holding the two martinis. So I went out to my vehicle, sat there, tried to catch my breath, and I then drove down the road a little and down the driveway to the barn and opened up the box of my truck, which had all my gear in it, and getting ready to suture this colt, when Percy pulls in his vintage Mercedes, and he drives down the hill to the barn. He saw my vehicle, and I'm greeted by, "Oh, Dr. Werner, how good to see you. By the way, have you seen Penelope yet?" And thinking to myself, all I could think is, I've seen more of Penelope than I ever planned, but a simple yes did the trick. And so it took me probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes to finish everything, to sew up the colt, put a bandage on it, etc. And then Percy said, "Well, now, why don't you come in for a drink?" Which I had done from time to time in the past, if it was the last call of the day. And I thought about it for a second, and I thought, I'll take a pass this time. Thinking to myself, you and Penelope no doubt have other business to take care of. So that was
story.
That story.
That's a great story.
And,
great story.
Well, let me give you a sense of what the area was like back then, 50 plus years ago. The Farmington Valley, and particularly outlying towns like Simsbury, Granby, etc., were far more agrarian then than they are now. When I came to Connecticut in 1974, the town of Granby contained 12 dairy farms that shipped milk commercially. About a month ago, the last one went out of business, or the cows were sold. So there are no farms shipping milk in Granby anymore. And there were other farms around. In Avon in particular, C.F. Woodford Farm on Nod Road was a very productive dairy farm for many years, and I would do their work. So as development increased, farming, it usually came at the expense of the different farms. And the same was true of the horse farms. There were back then more small operations that are now taken up by developments, cluster housing, that kind of thing. On Lovely Street in Canton, there was one in particular owned by a man named Jack McGrain. And Jack was a throwback, certainly to the early 20th century, maybe even before then. He was a lifelong horse trainer. He'd started his career in central Kentucky and came to New England, and he trained American saddlebred horses as show horses. He was very gruff, and he sat every day in a worn-out, overstuffed chair in the middle of his riding arena with a pack of Lucky Strikes and a bottle of Jack Daniels right next to him. And as he sat there, he would bark out orders to the riders of the horses that he was training as they would ride in oblongs around him. Well, Jack had a friend of his, an older man, his first name was Carl, who he kind of took in. In the earlier days, Carl was a retired man who just wanted to stay busy. So Jack said, well, you can come here, Carl. I'll give you little jobs to do. As time went on, Carl became less aware cognitively, as happens so often with elderly people.
Sure.
He drove a big Delta 88 Oldsmobile, and he started to develop a pattern of driving the Oldsmobile around Canton and Avon, getting out to walk to see something, and then being unable to find his Oldsmobile.
Oh, wow.
And the Avon and Canton police were getting a little tired of picking Carl up, driving him back to Lovely Street to McGrain Stable and somebody following in the Oldsmobile. So they said to Jack, can you do something about this? And typical Jack McGrain, of course I can. And he parked the Delta 88 behind his barn on Lovely Street and removed the distributor. So now the Delta 88 wasn't going anywhere. Well, Carl was becoming increasingly forgetful and impaired cognizant-wise. And when I would do my veterinary calls there, I always took a few minutes to talk to Carl because he was a very social individual. And he and I would lean on the hood of the Delta 88 as he would say to me, now, Doc, you know I drive a Delta 88, don't you? I'd say, yes, I do, Carl. Well, if you see that around Canton or Avon, would you call me? I said, of course I will. Naturally, I never called him.
Right.
But that was Jack McGrain. I want to tell you about an individual for whom I had tremendous respect, and this man was the riding instructor at the Ethel Walker School for decades. His name was Julius Mihaly, and as a young man, he was a cavalry officer in Hungary. Wow. The Second World War came along, and he was captured along with his cavalry regiment and taken prisoner of war. But he was one of the lucky ones in the sense that the camp commandant identified his ability to not just to ride, but to teach riding, and engaged Julius to instruct his daughter, the camp commandant's daughter, how to ride properly. And this is literally a 19th century form of riding, strict adherence to the rules, and especially to what is known as dressage, which was developed as a cavalry maneuver.
So this person was not trained on a farm or anything. They were trained by a military type
That's
discipline.
correct.
Yeah.
That's right. So he had this kind of dual relationship with the commandant. In the one sense, the commandant was his captor and kept him imprisoned. On the other hand, he was responsible for teaching his daughter. And so Julius and the commandant became friends, despite the circumstances. Well, then along came an opportunity to attempt an escape from the camp. And several of Julius's colleagues came to him and said, "Would you join us in this attempt?" And giving it some thought, he said, "Yes, I will." And they managed to pull this off successfully. They made it to Paris, France, and if I had to use one term to describe Julius, it was that he was an old world gentleman. So he gets to Paris as an escapee, POW, and he wires a telegram to the camp commandant apologizing for not having said goodbye. But under the circumstances, I think you'll understand, was what he told the commandant.
Gentlemanly in a way.
Oh, absolutely. And so then he makes it to this country. He encountered someone who sponsored him reaching out to different equine facilities, and he was hired by the Ethel Walker School. Now, if you drive down Bushy Hill Road, on the west side of Bushy Hill Road, right in front of the Ethel Walker School horse barn, is a frame house, two-story frame house. That was where Julius and his wife lived. And he was an insomniac. And I was, at that time, working by myself. My practice was 24/7. Got an emergency at 2 in the morning, you went. It's just how it was, cows and horses. And if I were south of Granby coming up Bush Hill Road, regardless of the hour, and I saw Julius's light on in his bedroom, I knew he was up and awake. And I would pull in, knock on the door, and he would come down, and he would make us both a cup of espresso, coffee, and he had a bottle of very thick Hungarian red wine. I can't pronounce the name in Hungarian, but it translated to bull's blood. So we would.
I used to be a wine vendor, so I'm familiar with that.
Are you?
Yeah. For 30 years as a wine vendor in Simsbury, right down the road from there.
So you know.
Oh
that.
yeah, of course.
Well, we would each have a more than just a cordial glass of bull's blood and our espresso. And the final thing I would tell you about him is, for anyone who has seen one of the Dracula movies, the Hungarian accent is, in my opinion, is unique.
Of course.
You can hear someone from Hungary speaking that accent, you know where they're from. And Joyce was also a chain smoker. Interestingly, he always held his cigarette, not like most Americans do, but he held it between his index and middle finger, pointing away from himself. And he would teach every morning, teach riding in the big arena at the Ethel Walker School. Well, I was going there 2-3 days a week sometimes to treat the different horses. And I would walk in the arena, and there would be Julius, particularly in cold weather, with a big, almost like a cloak type jacket and his cap, holding his cigarette out. And as he realized I was walking into the arena, he would turn around and I would hear, "Good morning, Harry." And it always reminded me of the Dracula movies. Yeah.
Now, what years are we talking about there? What period?
Well, that would have been 1974 for about 10 years. And then he retired.
Because whatever I know, Ethel Walker, if somebody was like yourself, a veterinary doctor who specializes in horses, I would imagine that was a center of activity.
It was.
Yeah.
It really was. It was. They had, I want to say, 60 horses back then. Most were student horses, but maybe a third were owned by the school, used as lesson horses. And every day there was riding. They had horse shows. So it was a very active place. They also had a very good farrier, horseshoer, who came there. It was Kriz Brothers, Kriz, from Bethany, Connecticut. And they go back in horse history as well. The two principals of that group were brothers, Joe and Johnny Kriz. Johnny would go to Jack McGreen's, previously mentioned, and shoe his saddlebred horses. Joe would go to the Ethel Walker School and shoe all those horses. Plus, they had many other customers. But they were old-time farriers. They could look at a horse move and pick up abnormalities and adjust the trim of the hoof, adjust the style of the shoe or the placement of the shoe, and in most cases improve the horse. They also had interesting history. They both had fought in the South Pacific in World War II. They were part of the invasion of Okinawa, and after the Japanese signed their surrender, both Joe and Johnny were kept on by the Army to trim and shoe Emperor Hirohito's horses.
Wow.
And stayed in Japan for quite a while till they were relieved of that duty.
Let me ask a question, because you
sure.
kind of opened the door to me. One of the things that I understand you work with is relationships between farriers and veterinarians. And it was that at times like a tense type of thing?
The answer to your question was that at times tense, absolutely, but not always. It depended largely, not totally, but largely on the attitude of the veterinarian, because the veterinarian is the one with the license to practice, the formal education,
Sure.
and having passed the examinations, etc. There is no licensure or examination of farriers in the United States. So there's a comparison and a contrast, if you will, between, and these are not my words, but it's the way it is in reality, the educated group and the quote-unquote uneducated group. Having said that, when I was a student at Penn, we had a resident farrier, Mr. Jack Anderson. Jack was one of the best teachers in the university, as far as I was concerned. And he would drum into us as students, you're all going to graduate, you all think you know everything about a lame horse and about putting shoes on it. He said, but until you're willing to strap on the apron and light up the forge, be very polite and careful how you talk to farriers. And he was absolutely right. And to this day, there's contention. I always pointed out to my younger associates that farriery as a profession existed for centuries before veterinary medicine ever did.
Interesting point.
Veterinary medicine came into being in the late, what do I want to say, 1789, I think, 18th century. Whereas farriers accompanied the Roman legions in their marches through Europe and wherever they went. And in fact, the word farrier comes from the Latin ferrous, for iron. So they're an old profession. In this country, again, there's no requirement for licensure. A lot of their education comes as from mentors or having done apprenticeship. But there are some that ought to be doing something different.
Like any profession,
Like
right?
And yes, like anything. And but they're an absolutely essential partner for anyone serious about equine practice. And I benefited far more from the farriers than I think they ever benefited from me. I was very blessed to have good relations with them.
I would imagine the better farriers and veterinarians would have way more in common than
That's true.
What divides them apart.
That's very true. That's very true. And that's especially true in the last 20 years when so much education is available over the internet. And I know people poo-poo the internet, and I'm one of them.
You ought to be critical at times of the internet.
But if you look critically at what's out there, there is tremendously helpful information for farriers that comes out of veterinary schools. Some of it comes out of private practices. In my practice, we did a newsletter 4 times a year for decades. And I always had a piece in there for a farrier to read about a particular problem and what the current thinking would be. And so we think that was helpful. Well, one of the goats that I took care of belonged to Mrs. Alsop on Notch Road. And I'm trying to think of that goat's name. I can't remember the goat's name. It was a pet goat. It had no function in life other than to provide companionship and entertainment for Mrs. Alsop. Mrs. Alsop also had a maid, Cammie, who was a lovely, wonderful person. And she was really my go-between when I would go there. It would always be Cammie that I would deal with. And Cammie had come up from the South. She wore every time I saw her, she wore a spotless, starched white dress that you would see someone in her job description wearing, a maid's dress. I am probably not using the right terms. And she would always greet me, "Oh, Dr. Werner, so good to see you. Now, you remember, if you need help, you call me." Well, the goat, whose name escapes me, was not well behaved. It didn't really care for veterinary work. I can't blame it for that. So my technician and I always rode with a technician. We would go out to the barn and corral this goat and capture it. And sometimes our job was quick and simple, like a vaccination. Sometimes it was more than that. It would involve trimming the feet or something. And that's when things got dicey. So when that bloody goat would not behave, I would put a halter on it and walk it to the house, the back of the house. Cammie would come out. Now, Cammie weighed in, I'm going to guess, maybe 225.
Okay.
And she would take that goat, and she'd have words with it. Now, Missy, you're going to lay down and you're going to behave. And she'd fling that goat down on its side, and then she would sit on it. And I would
sit on the goat.
Sit on it, all 225 pounds. And I would go ahead and trim each foot nicely. Of course, the whole time the goat's blatting and screaming and calling for help for itself. And when we were all done, Cammie she'd always look at me first, and she'd say, "Now, doctor, are you done?" I'd say, "Yes, I am, Cammie." Up she'd get, and then she would part with the goat by saying, "Now, there's no need to do that if you would just behave yourself." Of course, the goat never did behave itself. And I would walk it back, and then back to the house to leave. Cammie would always have made something like brownies or some treat for us that we went. So it was a great pleasure to work for her. And then also right in that neck of the woods off Waterville Road was Mr. Enders, Ostrom Enders. And he was, I want to say he was 90-ish when I worked for him.
And what period of time are we talking?
Yeah, we're going back 35 years anyway.
Okay, all right.
These are rough estimates,
Yep.
Jim, as far as my alleged memory.
You would be the only one to check.
Right. But Mr. Ostromenders had a small flock, relatively small. It wasn't all that small, maybe 20 so-called Jacob sheep. No, they weren't Jacobs, excuse me. Cheviot sheep. Cheviots are very small. They're the size. They don't get much bigger than a mid-sized dog. And any Cheviot I ever saw was as crazy as a bedbug. These things run around, and they do not want to be captured or held, and they can leap into the air.
Were they common farm animals at the time, or?
Well, there was a time when they were. I never got Mr. Enders to clearly explain why he had Cheviots, or for that matter, why he had any livestock at his age. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, he had a younger man who managed everything. And I tried every time I went there. I only had to go to do vaccination and deworming maybe twice a year, because this gentleman, whose name escapes me, did an excellent job caring for them. But my big fear was Mr. Enders would get knocked over, and he would come out with his cane and walk out in the middle of the barn with his 20 to 24 crazy Cheviots, literally jumping 3 feet in the air and racing around. And how he never got knocked over or broke a hip is beyond me. And I would practically beg him, "Why don't you just stay out of the action here? My technician and I will take care of everything." But no, he had to be out there, and so he was. This was on the Bloomfield Avon end of things. I had a client, his first name was Rose, and she was a horsewoman, a lifelong horsewoman. She'd grown up in the DuPont area of northern Delaware and lived with horses her whole life. So she came up here to live, and she called me one day. It was a very cold day. It was the middle of winter. She called me. I was at the Ethel Walker School working. I remember taking the call. And again, I'm going back maybe 30 years, 25 years anyway, 30 years. "Oh," she says, "Dr. Werner, I have a problem." "What's your problem, Rose?" "Well, my horse appears to be at the bottom of a hill, rolled onto his back and stuck there. And I said, well, you said he appears to be. He weighs about 1,100 pounds. Is he down there stuck or not? Oh, yes, he's down there stuck. I said, all right, I'll come over. And the horse, this was on Doncaster Road. Mm-hmm. So I drive over to Doncaster Road with my technician, and I get out, and there's Rose. And sure enough, there's the horse down there on his back, like a turtle on his back, stuck against a stone wall. And what had happened was she had been riding him at a walk along Doncaster Road. Why in the middle of winter on icy ground, I don't know. She knew better than that, but regardless, she did. The horse slipped on the ice, fell out from under her. She did not get hurt. But the horse then proceeded to slide down this icy hill and wind up on his back. So there was Rose standing there, and a local farmer whose name escapes older man. And I said, well, first of all, we need help. We need more hands, and we need some traction. I said to the farmer, do you have sand or anything? Yes, I can come back with sand. So he came back with a loader with sand in the bucket, and we spilled that down the hillside. So there was some traction. And I said to Rose, and by that point, a young lady in her 20s, I would guess, a friend of Rose's, showed up and said, oh, I can go get my boyfriend. I said, please do that. We really need hands here. And so while she was doing that, I took my ropes out of my truck and I arranged them appropriately on the legs of the horse and around the neck. And she shows up with her boyfriend, giant of a guy, big, very athletic, young guy, blonde hair, maybe, I don't know, maybe 23 years old, that kind of thing, smiling constantly. And at this point, I was paying attention to what I had to get done. I was also annoyed with Rose, who I'd known for years. She knew I was annoyed with her, so she was being pretty quiet. And all this fellow would do would smile. So I said, well, that's okay if he doesn't want to talk. So I had the ropes arranged. I said, now, to the different people, I said, okay, you get on this rope, you get on that rope, you get on this rope, and then I came to her boyfriend. I said, now you get on this rope. This is the most important rope. It was the upward hind leg. I said, and nobody pulls till I say pull. When I say pull, you all pull together. We've got to roll this horse over onto its chest. And he just smiled. And so I looked at him and I said, you understand, you pull when I say pull. Didn't nod his head or anything, just kept smiling. I said, oh, God, hopefully he heard me. So we did a 1, 2, 3 pull. Everyone pulled, the horse immediately rolled over onto his chest. And then this young fella grabs the horse by the base of the tail, right as it joins the body, and practically lifts the whole horse up. He certainly lifts his hind
By the tail?
By himself.
Wow.
Lifts the hind end up and gets it standing there. And then the horse itself struggled enough to get its front end up. And typically horses get up the other way. They put their front legs out, hoist themselves up, and then bring the rear up. But under the circumstances, this was how it had to be. So now the horse is standing, and he was cold. He'd been laying there for a while, so he was shivering, and we put some blankets on him, and we gave him 15, 20 minutes to warm up, get his circulation back, and slowly walked him up, very carefully walked him up the sanded hillside, and he got up and made it to the top, and nothing wrong with him.
No injuries at all?
No injuries at all. So I was thanking the people for their help, because we couldn't have done it without each of them. And I got to this big fellow, and I said, thank you. And he must have understood what thank you meant, because he nodded his head. I turned to the girl. I said, does he speak? And she says, oh, yes, but he doesn't speak English. I said, well, what does he speak? He speaks Swedish. I said, who is he? She says, that's Ulf Samuelsson.
Oh, really?
He had just signed on with the Hartford Whalers
That's amazing.
as a defenseman.
Everybody of an era knows who Ulf Samuelsson is, a group around here.
And ultimately made it to the Hockey Hall of Fame. Very, very excellent defenseman. But at that point, he didn't know a word of English. But I will tell you that he was I'd still be out there trying to get that horse up if it hadn't been for him. And then he reaches in his pocket, and she's my technician and myself, and gives us each tickets to a Whalers game.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
I did not see that coming.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't. And I'm just thinking, what's wrong with this guy? Can he speak English? Yeah. No, he can't.
That's remarkable.
One of the things that it's just part of me, of my makeup, is that when I go to sleep at night, I go to sleep, and of course the type of work I did, we always for decades provided 24/7 emergency care. And this goes back to the answering service days. Nowadays you have your iPhone with all kinds of capabilities, but back in the day, a client would notice a problem, would call the answering service, would call me, give me the name and number, I'd call them back, that kind of thing. And so one evening, the phone rang, and at this point, I think my wife answered the phone. She never botched the deal. I could never remember whether I was in Granby or where I was. So she hands me the phone, says, you need to talk to Mrs. So-and-so. Well, this was at a time when we still did a lot of small dairy farms as well as some of the big ones. And the small, old-time farmers never identified their cows with numbers like the big farms did. The cows always had female names. This one was Betty. This one was Ethel.
And they were accounted for that way. So the farmer knew that the farmer knew that the cow's names.
Yes. Yeah. So the answering service says to me, "You need to call Mrs. So-and-so. Betty is no better." And okay, I'll do that. And she gave me the number, and I dialed the number. And the whole time I'm thinking, no, I had seen quite a few cows that day. Which one was Betty, and what was wrong with her? And, trying to jog my memory. And the lady comes on, the owner comes on. "Oh, Dr. Werner, thank you so much for calling." I said, "Oh, of course, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm sorry to hear Betty isn't doing any better. Is she off feed today?" "What?" "No," I said, "is she off feed?" "You mean, is she not eating?" "Yes." "Well, of course she's not eating. She's sick. She doesn't feel well." And a number of other questions. And then finally I said to her, "Well, is there any chance Betty's in heat today?" "Oh, I've had it." And she hangs the phone up. Well, my wife had been listening to this, and she said, "Who sent you that call?" I said, "Our answering service." Turns out, and this is when I was working for Dr. Milky in Granby. It was before I went on my own. Mm-hmm. Turns out that the answering service for Milky, Davis, Miller, and Werner was the same answering service for Miller, Werner, and Levine, a pediatrician practice.
Oh, wow.
And so here I am asking this distraught young mother if her daughter's in heat. and
Wow.
And might she be off feed that day? So I think it was at that point, actually, that Susan said, you know what, the phone is living on my side of the bed. And from that point on, she took all
She was the filter.
She was the filter. She took all the calls. Mostly what I took care of were cattle and horses. But the occasional pig would come along. In fact, in the early days, there were 2 big farms, each owned by a brother, Chris Brothers, on Woodland Avenue in Bloomfield, and they each had somewhere between 50 and 100 sows on their property, and I would do their work. Those days are all gone now. But I also took care of a miniature potbelly pig that lived, of all places, in a house. It was litter pan trained, on Scarborough Street in West Hartford. You know Scarborough Street.
Yeah, sure.
Come over the mountain.
Mansion.
Kind of an upscale area, and this little pig lived in there with. The man was an attorney in Hartford. And all I ever did for that little pig was trim its feet. It needed its toenails, a pedicure, twice a year. And his helper would load the pig in the car, in a van, bring it to North Granby to my clinic. I would trim its feet as it screamed at the top of its lungs the whole time, just being restrained. And then back to Scarborough Street and its life of luxury. It would go. And I also took care of another pig, a Yorkshire sow. It was a pet. Lived on Route 44 in Canton behind the farm appliance store. And this pig was kept in immaculate conditions. The man and his wife kept the pen just like it was brand new with clean wood shavings. And they played classical music to this pig. And they'd had it since it was a wee baby, and by the time I got to know it, it was 400, 500 pounds, big sow. And I could go in and vaccinate it, stick the vaccine needles in it as long as the music was playing and it wouldn't budge. So I was never a pig doctor, but I had these entertaining clients that...
You open the door for me because this is a question I've always been curious. I'm intrigued with like veterinarians, how they're expected to adapt to like, I think the word I'm looking for, like physiology of different animals. And also like, it seems like on an incredibly rapid pace of like diseases that only certain animals get. How did you adapt to those types of changes?
Well, that's a question that speaks to the heart of, how do I want to put it, the heart of, this is my opinion now, of what I think is proper practice in the year 2026. The information load grows exponentially. It doesn't grow linearly. Mm-hmm. What we know now and see now as problems compared to 1974 when I started is huge. Also, the technology, the development of technology has been huge, but you have to know how to use that technology. For example, when the later years of my horse practice, well, the last over 20 years, we had portable digital X-ray. I could put the panel behind the horse's leg, hit the button, and in 4 seconds have an image, read a perfectly excellent image. Back in the day when I started, it was all take your pictures, go back to the clinic, develop them, hope that they all turned out. If they didn't, get back out and repeat. In the later years, we had a 3-meter, 10-foot-long video endoscope that would go down the horse's esophagus into their stomach because we learned somewhere in the 90s about stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers in horses, and the fact that they're very, very prevalent in performance horses that go to horse shows and racing and that kind of thing. We had digital ultrasound. And so these are all technologies that you have to learn. You can't just buy the equipment. You have to become proficient using it. And then, as you alluded to, there were infectious diseases that we had to deal with that were not there in the 70s. There was no Lyme disease. That came about well, there was Lyme disease, but nobody knew what it was. That came about around 1980. And great credit to the University of Connecticut Laboratory, which has worked with Yale New Haven Laboratory for decades on refining the techniques for diagnosing the presence of that organism, not just in horses, but in all animals and in people. But we didn't have that in the 70s. The condition known as EPM, or equine protozoal myeloencephalitis, which is a nasty neurologic disease, we didn't have that back then. We had it, but we didn't know what we were looking at. And other such diseases, muscular, genetic-based muscular diseases. Students going through school now have to embrace all of that and learn that. And even back in the mid-70s, it was my own personal feeling that as much fun as it is to sit down at night and watch James Herriot, All Creatures Great and Small, where they literally do see all creatures great and small, that's a bygone era. If you're going to do it correctly, there's just too much information and too much investment that's very appropriate to make in sustaining a clinical practice. If that answers.
No, I think so. Do you think? I mean, to what perspective would you say your experience, if, say, I was a young veterinarian and just getting out of veterinary school, to what degree does your experience lend itself to being a keeper of wisdom to a younger, more specialized generation? What kind of... You just gave me a whole bunch of hands-on examples that they never could teach you in veterinary school.
As a mentor type.
Yes, as a mentor. That's exactly what I'm getting at.
Well, I think that the first thing I would tell, and I have done this, a new veterinarian or a veterinary student is, above all else, learn how to do a physical examination. I won't say all physical examinations are the same across species lines, because there are differences in species. Cows have 4 stomachs, horses have 1. You have to know how to examine all 4 versus 1. But for species upon which you plan to work, you must know how to do the physical examination, because this equipment that I'm talking about, the endoscopes, the digital radiography, the digital ultrasonography, and on, before you touch those things, you have to have a reason to. You have to have a reason to get it out of your truck or whatever, and that reason comes to you through your findings on a physical examination. So that would be the primary thing I would say. The secondary thing, really of equal importance, is if you're called to see a species with which you're unfamiliar, go and do your best, but if you're coming up against a wall, be very, very quick to refer it. First of all, for the animal's sake. So, am I speaking to your question?
Absolutely,
So I'll give you an example. In my own experience, a couple examples maybe. One is, goes back 40-some years, and I think it was the Shrine Circus that came to Springfield.
I remember that. That was a big deal back
It was
back
a
in the
big
day.
deal.
Yeah.
That's right. I got a phone call one day from the Shrine Circus. Would I come up and see one of their elephants? And I said, well, I don't think you really want me. I said, I love elephants, but I've never touched an elephant, and I have no idea, I have no experience. Well, your W in the Yellow Pages, back then we had Yellow Pages. This
Of course.
was long before,
Phones. And,
yeah.
yeah.
Your W, we've come all the way down to you, nobody else will come. And
I get it now.
And I'm saying, now, was that a compliment?
Yeah,
or,
right. End of the alphabet.
Yeah. So I felt for the elephant. I said, well, I'll come up. I'll see what I can do. I said, but I have no experience. So anyway, I went up to Springfield to the Coliseum, and the elephant was one of a group of 4, and their performance act involved a round stool type thing, big table type thing. 3 of the elephants would put their feet on this revolving table, and the 4th would go up on its hind legs. No, the 4th was standing on the table. The other 3 would put their feet up on its back, and the table would revolve, and the elephants would walk with the table around with this one elephant in the center on the table.
Circus trick thing, yeah.
Yeah,
I got you.
that's right. And so somebody had clunked their feet down too hard on this central elephant, and it had a hematoma, which is nothing more than a broken blood vessel under the skin. But this hematoma was easily the size of a large pizza. It was huge. And there was pain involved for the elephant. And this was a female Indian elephant, weighed close to 10,000 pounds. So they had the 4 I watched this act first, and as its mates put their feet on it, this elephant actually vocalized. Well, the crowd all thought that was part of the act, but it wasn't. It was the pain that it felt. So they finished the act. They brought the 4 elephants back, hooked them each to their cleat on the floor. And the trainer, I was very impressed with the trainer and with the animals' demeanor toward the trainer. To me, there was no evidence that they were afraid of the trainer, but rather that they aimed to please the trainer. That might be taking it a little too far, but those were the vibes.
Trainer appeared to be working with the animals rather than working against them.
Exactly. So I reached up and felt this hematoma. I said, well, somehow I got to get up there. So we took a couple bales of hay and built a stairway up the side of the elephant. And I checked it out, and so we scrubbed the whole thing up surgically, and took some very large bore needles and plunked them in to drain this thing out, and then flushed it with a couple liters of saline, and then instilled antibiotic solution into it, put small bandages over the needle holes, and then it came time to give the elephant 2 drugs orally. One was a non-steroidal, like we would take an Advil-type drug called phenylbutazone. And all I had, I didn't have elephant pills, I had horse pills. And those pills were about 2 inches by 1 inch. And the same size pill was an antibiotic pill, a sulfa drug. Well, you'd give 1 to 1,000 pounds for a horse or cow, so I wound up having to give 10 of each to this elephant. How am I going to do that? Well, the trainer said...
And you had to do, let's say, fast math yourself, guessing the proportions of horses that you knew to elephants at
Yes. And, Jim, the whole time that I'm doing that, I'm crossing my fingers and saying, well, I hope elephants don't have an untoward reaction to this particular drug or that. And who knows? I didn't know, but I was trying to be honest with the people. I said, look, I don't know, but I know that the animal needs pain relief, and I know it needs an antibiotic. So the trainer said, well, I think we can get those into her. It was a female elephant. I'll be back in a few minutes. And he ran across Route 75. This was at the Coliseum. He ran across the street, not Route 75, to a deli. And he bought 2 large loaves of what I would call French bread. It looked like torpedoes. And he came back and made a canoe out of each one, cut the center out, stuffed 10 pills in that one, 10 pills in this one, put the piece of bread that he'd cut out back on, and one at a time he handed those to the elephant. She took it in her trunk, swallowed, that was gone. Give her the second one, she put that in her trunk, swallowed it, and that was gone. And then the final thing I wanted to do was get a blood sample out of her just to check it for a white count. I didn't think this thing was a runaway infection, but I wanted to be sure. I said, how do we get this blood sample? Well, he says, that's easy. And on the perimeter of their ear runs a vein. You see it. And I said, will she be all right? Oh, she'll be fine. So I stuck it with a needle and syringe, got my blood sample, climbed down. The whole time I was up on those bales working on her, she had her trunk wrapped around one of my ankles. And when she first did that, it didn't scare me because, again, there was nothing aggressive about this animal that I could detect. But I did say to the trainer, what's with the trunk? He says, that's just hand holding. She wants to, that'll keep her calm. I did once or twice have a vision of her flinging me from West Springfield across the Connecticut River, but she didn't do that.
Understood, yeah.
Yeah. And then, and so finally we got all done. I packed up. And I went home, and for a solid year, everywhere that circus landed around the United States, I would get a little postcard from him, from the trainer. I forget the elephant's name, telling me how well she was doing. So N=1 for elephants. So far, I'm an elephant expert.
Flawless.
Yeah. Interestingly, I said to him in conversation, by the way, how much do you pay for an elephant like this? Now, this was many years ago. He said, an elephant trained like this or tamed like this, they're all Indian elephants because the African elephants are too hyper. He said would be $45,000. He told me this after I was done working on her. He said, but this one we got for free. I said, why is that? He said, well, she was given to us from Busch Gardens because she killed her keeper.
Wow.
Apparently the keeper had an alcohol problem and would come in at night and taunt her. And one night enough was enough, and that was that. I mean, he didn't tell me that till I was done working on her. But
that's a good thing.
Yeah. So that was my one and only elephant case. Well, maybe I'll add a quick one. Early January of 1979, I started my own practice, and this was when there was no internet, there were no computers, or at least in common use or anything. So I had very little equipment. I had my surgical pack of instruments that I had to buy as a student at Penn, and colleague on Route 10, Rod Kaufman, who owned and operated Hot Meadow Animal Hospital, he said, look, here's a handful of suture material and a few scalpels. He said, the trouble is the suture material is all dog and cat. I said, that's all right, I'll take it. So that was a Friday, And I'm hoping and praying, no calls till Monday. I'll drive to Northern Mass, Billerica, which is where the nearest veterinary equipment distributor was, and I'll buy everything I need. Well, Murphy's Law. Saturday, the phone rings, Saturday night, and it's a farmer up on the mountaintop in East Heartland. And that's not the Arctic Circle, but you can see the Arctic Circle from there. It is cold in winter and
Yeah,
windy
that's out
up
there. You know.
So he said, I need you to come up here. My cow can't calf. And I said, Dwight, I'll come up, but why don't you let me call the local practice? They'll send somebody up with better equipment. No, well, I don't know what axe he was grinding with them. To this day, I don't, but he wouldn't have them. So I went up. And sure enough, it's always their best cow, at least according to the farmer. This enormous Holstein cow, all the way down the end of the row, was down and huffing and puffing and trying to get this calf out. Well, once you've done a little bit of obstetrics, it's pretty obvious when you go in the rear end of the cow whether this is going to be a conventional delivery or you need to do a cesarean section. And this one was obviously a C-section. I said, Dwight, who, by the way, fit the profile of what we would call swamp Yankee. That's kind of an old New England farmer.
Yeah.
Species practically gone now. But I said, Dwight, this really needs a C-section. Why don't you let me call Dr. Miller? He'll come up. No, not going to have him. I'll shoot her first, which he would have. So this was January, freezing cold. The barn was all stone walls, and it was filled with Holstein cows relaxing, eating their hay, breathing, and so there was thick fog on the floor because it's the way stone barns are in the winter. It came up almost to your waist. It was just their breath, and it's actually kind of beautiful because you see all this fog, and so I said, all right, you have to help me, Dwight. Well, I won't. I don't help with things like this. He was in his 70s. I'll get my sister. I said, let me guess. I've never met your sister. I'll bet she's older than you. Yeah, she is. And so I got out my clippers, got out my surgery pack, got out my drapes, clipped the cow up. Cow wouldn't get up. Clipped her left side, laid all my surgical drapes on a bale of hay, laid the sterile drapes on, had my equipment there, and what you do is you clip about a 1 foot by 2 foot rectangle, and then you nerve block your incision line, just Novocaine, straight down under the skin where you're going to cut. Then you do your surgical prep, get your gloves on, take your scalpel, cut. Well, I did all that, cut through into the abdomen, and just then I see someone walking down the aisleway in this fog, thick fog. And it's Dwight's sister, Ellie, who was, in fact, older. She had white hair. She looked like a ghost coming down here. So she gets all the way down. I had never met her. I said, you must be Ellie. Yes. So, Ellie, you sit there and don't touch anything. These things are all sterile. Do not touch them. Okay. And she sat down. So at this point, I cut open the uterus and grabbed the calf by the feet and pulled it out, pulled it up in front of its mother, who then licked it off and got its breathing going and everything. And I came back, stripped my gloves, put on a brand new pair, and I reached then for an instrument called a needle holder, which is just what it says. It's like a pliers. It holds a round, in this case, a round curved needle that you close the uterus with. As I reached for it, into my hand comes the needle holder with the needle, with the small animal catgut tripled up in the in the eye of the needle. And that came from Ellie. And I look at her hands, and she had pulled on a new pair of my 7.5 surgical gloves. Her hands were probably 5.5, so the fingertips are waving in the wind. But she slapped that thing without me saying a word into my hand. And I looked at it and I thought, oh man, I said, I thought I was going to bury my mistake up here. Where did you work? She says, Doctor, I was the chief OR nurse at Bellevue Hospital in New York City for 35 years. And then she says, and your patient's going to do just fine. So on we went. We sewed the uterus up, sewed up the musculature of the body wall, sewed up the skin, peeled the gloves, put everything away. And I said, well, Ellie, I guess I don't have to tell you that this is going to be nip and tuck for several days here with this lightweight dog and cat suture material. And she said, no, doctor, your patient will do just fine. And I left it by saying, no, our patient will do just fine. And the cow never looked back.
A fateful crossing of talents there. Huh?
Yes, that's right. That's right. But what are the odds on a hilltop in East Heartland?
100% because it happened, right?
Yeah. So that's my story.
Fantastic. Well, I had fun. Thank you for being on, Doctor.
It was a pleasure. Really was. Thank you for having me.
Whether listening to his stories from the stalls of barns or tracing the incredible evolution of his career, it's clear that Dr. Werner's 50-year legacy isn't just about the medicine. It's about a mutual respect of the many folks' paths he's crossed and an unwavering dedication to the animals that shaped the agrarian landscape of his day. I'm Jim Pavish, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Avon Talks podcast. Avon Talks, where the recordings of the present day capture the echoes of the past.